This podcast is part of the audiobook edition of The Discovery of India, produced by Giribala Joshi, using advanced text-to-speech technology.
Chapter 7, The Last Phase, 1. Part 1, Consolidation of British Rule and Rise of Nationalist Movement, the Ideology of Empire, the New Caste. Our writing of India's history is perhaps resented more than anything else we have done, so writes an Englishman well acquainted with India and her history. It is difficult to say what Indians have resented most in the record of British rule in India. The list is long and varied. But it is true that British accounts of India's history, more especially of what is called the British period, are bitterly resented. History is almost always written by the victors and conquerors, and gives their viewpoint, or, at any rate, the victor's version is given prominence, and holds the field. Very probably, all the early records we have of the Aryans in India, their epics and traditions, glorify the Aryans, and are unfair to the people of the country whom they subdued. No individual can wholly rid himself of his racial outlook and cultural limitations, and when there is conflict between races and countries, even an attempt at impartiality is considered a betrayal of one's own people. War, which is an extreme example of this conflict, results in a deliberate throwing overboard of all fairness and impartiality. So far as the enemy nation is concerned, the mind coarsens, and becomes closed to almost all avenues of approach except one. The overpowering need of the moment is to justify one's own actions, and condemn and blacken those of the enemy. Truth hides somewhere at the bottom of the deepest well, and falsehood, naked and unashamed, reigns almost supreme. Even when actual war is not being waged, there is often potential war and conflicts between rival countries and interests. In a country dominated by an alien power, that conflict is inherent and continuous, and affects and perverts people's thoughts and actions. The war mentality is never wholly absent. In the old days, when war and its consequences, brutality and conquest and enslavement of a people, were accepted as belonging to the natural order of events, there was no particular need to cover them or justify them from some other point of view. With the growth of higher standards, the need for justification has arisen, and this leads to a perversion of facts, sometimes deliberate, often unconscious. Thus hypocrisy pays its tribute to virtue, and a false and sickening piety allies itself to evil deeds. In any country, and especially in a huge country like India, with its complicated history and mixed culture, it is always possible to find facts and trends to justify a particular thesis, and then this becomes the accepted basis for a new argument. America, it is said, is a land of contradictions, in spite of its standardization and uniformity. How much more then must India be full of contradictions and incongruities? We shall find there, as elsewhere, what we seek, and on this preconceived basis we can build up a structure of belief and opinion. And yet that structure will have untrue foundations and will give a false picture of reality. Recent Indian history, that is the history of the British period, is so connected with present-day happenings, that the passions and prejudices of today powerfully influence our interpretation of it. Englishmen and Indians are both likely to err, though their errors will lie in opposite directions. Far the greater part of the records and papers, out of which history takes shape, and is written comes from British sources, and inevitably represents the British point of view. The very circumstances of defeat and disruption prevented the Indian side of the story from being properly recorded, and many of the records that existed suffered destruction during the Great Revolt of 1857. The papers that survived were hidden away in family archives, and could not be published for fear of consequences. They remained dispersed, little known, and many perished in the manuscript stage from the incursion of termites and other insects, which abound in the country. At a later stage, when some of these papers were discovered, they threw a new light on many historical incidents. Even British written Indian history had to be somewhat modified, and the Indian conception, often very different from the British, took shape. Behind this conception lay also a mass of tradition and memories, not of the remote past but of a period when our grandfathers and great-grandfathers were the living witnesses, and often the victims of events. As history, this tradition may have little value, but it is important as it enables us to understand the background of the Indian mind today. The villain of the British in India is often a hero to Indians, and those whom the British have delighted to honor and reward are often traitors and quislings in the eyes of the great majority of the Indian people. That taint clings to their descendants. The history of the American Revolution has been differently written by Englishmen and Americans, and even today when old passions have subsided, and there is friendship between the two peoples, each version is resented by the other party. In our own day, Lenin was a monster and a brigand to many English statesmen of high repute, yet millions have considered him as a savior and the greatest man of the age. These comparisons will give us some faint idea of the resentment felt by Indians at being forced to study in their schools and colleges so-called histories which disparage India's past in every way, vilify those whose memory they cherish, and honor and glorify the achievements of British rule in India. Gopal Krishna Gokhale once wrote in his gently ironical way of the inscrutable wisdom of Providence, which had ordained the British connection for India. Whether it was due to this inscrutable wisdom, or to some process of historic destiny or just chance, the coming of the British to India brought two very different races together, or, at any rate, it should have brought them together, but as it happened, they seldom approached each other, and their contacts were indirect. English literature, and English political thought, influenced a tiny fringe of those who had learned English. But this political thought, though dynamic in its context, had no reality in India then. The British who came to India were not political or social revolutionaries, they were conservatives representing the most reactionary social class in England, and England was in some ways one of the most conservative countries in Europe. The impact of Western culture on India was the impact of a dynamic society, of a modern consciousness, on a static society wedded to medieval habits of thought which, however sophisticated and advanced in its own way, could not progress because of its inherent limitations. And, yet, curiously enough, the agents of this historic process were not only wholly unconscious of their mission in India but, as a class, actually represented no such process. In England, their class fought this historic process but the forces opposed to them were too strong, and could not be held back. In India they had a free field, and were successful in applying the brakes to that very change and progress, which, in the larger context, they represented. They encouraged and consolidated the position of the socially reactionary groups in India, and opposed all those who worked for political and social change. If change came, it was in spite of them, or as an incidental and unexpected consequence of their activities. The introduction of the steam engine and the railway was a big step towards a change of the medieval structure, but it was intended to consolidate their rule and facilitate the exploitation for their own benefit of the interior of the country. This contradiction between the deliberate policy of the British authorities in India and some of its unintended consequences produces a certain confusion and masks that policy itself. Change came to India because of this impact of the West, but it came almost in spite of the British in India. They succeeded in slowing down the pace of that change to such an extent that even today, the transition is very far from complete. The feudal landlords and their kind, who came from England to rule over India, had the landlord's view of the world. To them India was a vast estate, belonging to the East India Company, and the landlord was the best and the natural representative of his estate and his tenants. That view continued even after the East India Company handed over its estate of India to the British Crown, being paid very handsome compensation at India's cost. Thus began the public debt of India. It was India's purchase money, paid by India. The British government of India then became the landlords, or landlords' agents. For all practical purposes they considered themselves India, just as the Duke of Devonshire might be considered Devonshire by his peers. The millions of people who lived and functioned in India were just some kind of landlord's tenants, who had to pay their rents and cesses and to keep their place in the natural feudal order. For them, a challenge to that order was an offense against the very moral basis of the universe and a denial of a divine dispensation. This somewhat metaphysical conception of British rule in India has not changed fundamentally, though it is expressed differently now. The old method of obvious rack-renting gave place to more subtle and devious devices. It was admitted that the landlord should be benevolent towards his tenantry and should seek to advance their interests. It was even agreed that some of the more loyal and faithful among the tenants should be promoted to the estate office and share in a subordinate way in the administration. But no challenge to the system of landlordism could be tolerated. The estate must continue to function as it used to even when it changed hands. When pressure of events made some such change inevitable, it was stipulated that all the faithful employees in the estate office should continue, all the old and new friends, followers and dependents of the landlord should be provided for, the old age pensioners should continue to draw their pensions, the old landlord himself should now function as a benevolent patron and advisor of the estate, and thus all attempts to bring about essential changes should be frustrated. This sense of identifying India with their own interests was strongest in the higher administrative services, which were entirely British. In later years, these developed in that close and well-knit corporation called the Indian Civil Service, the world's most tenacious trade union, as it has been called by an English writer. They ran India, they were India, and anything that was harmful to their interests must of necessity be injurious to India. From the Indian civil service and the kind of history and record of current events that was placed before them, this conception spread in varying degrees to the different strata of the British people. The ruling class naturally shared it in full measure, but even the worker and the farmer were influenced by it to some slight extent, and felt, in spite of their own subordinate position in their own country, the pride of possession and empire. That same worker or farmer, if he came to India, inevitably belonged to the ruling class here. He was totally ignorant of India's history and culture, and he accepted the prevailing ideology of the British in India, for he had no other standards to judge by or apply. At the most a vague benevolence filled him, but that was strictly conditioned within that framework. For 100 years, this ideology permeated all sections of the British people, and became, as it were, a national heritage, a fixed and almost unalterable notion, which governed their outlook on India, and imperceptibly affected even their domestic outlook. In our own day, that curious group, which has no fixed standards or principles or much knowledge of the outside world, the leaders of the British Labour Party, have usually been the staunchest supporters of the existing order in India. Sometimes a vague sense of uneasiness fills them at a seeming contradiction between their domestic and colonial policy, between their professions and practice, but, considering themselves above all as practical men of common sense, they sternly repress all these stirrings of conscience. Practical men must necessarily base themselves on established and known practice, on existing conditions, and not take a leap into the dark unknown merely because of some principle or untested theory. Viceroys who come to India direct from England have to fit in with and rely upon the Indian civil service structure. Belonging to the possessing and ruling class in England, they have no difficulty whatever in accepting the prevailing ICS outlook, and their unique position of absolute authority, unparalleled elsewhere, leads to subtle changes in their ways and methods of expression. Authority corrupts, and absolute authority corrupts absolutely, and no man in the wide world today has had or has such absolute authority over such large number of people as the British Viceroy of India. The Viceroy speaks in a manner such as no Prime Minister of England or President of the United States can adopt. The only possible parallel would be that of Hitler. And not the Viceroy only, but the British members of his council, the governors, and even the smaller fry who function as secretaries of departments or magistrates. They speak from a noble and unattainable height, secure not only in the conviction that what they say and do is right, but that it will have to be accepted as right whatever lesser mortals may imagine, for theirs is the power and the glory. Some members of the Viceroy's Council are appointed direct from England and do not belong to the Indian Civil Service. There is usually a marked difference in their ways and utterances from those of the civil service. They function easily enough in that framework, but they cannot quite develop that superior and self-satisfied air of assured authority. Much less can the Indian members of the Council, a fairly recent addition, who are obvious supers, whatever their numbers or intelligence. Indians belonging to the civil service, whatever their rank in the official hierarchy, do not belong to the charmed circle. A few of them try to ape the manners of their colleagues without much success. They become rather pompous and ridiculous. The new generation of British members of the Indian Civil Service are, I believe, somewhat different in mind and texture from their predecessors. They do not easily fit into the old framework, but all authority and policy flow from the senior members, and the newcomers make no difference. They have either to accept the established order or, as has sometimes happened, resign and return to their homeland. I remember that when I was a boy, the British-owned newspapers in India were full of official news and utterances, of service news, transfers and promotions, of the doings of English society, of polo, races, dances, and amateur theatricals. There was hardly a word about the people of India, about their political, cultural, social, or economic life. Reading them, one would hardly suspect that they existed. In Bombay there used to be quadrangular cricket matches between 4 11s made up respectively of Hindus, Muslims, Parsis, and Europeans. The European 11 was called Bombay Presidency, the others were just Hindus, Muslims, Parsis. Bombay was thus, essentially represented by the Europeans, the others, one would imagine, were foreign elements who were recognized for this purpose. These quadrangular matches still take place, though there is much argument about them, and a demand that 11s should not be chosen on religious lines. I believe that the Bombay Presidency team is now called European. English clubs in India usually have territorial names, the Bengal Club, the Allahabad Club, etc. They are confined to Britishers, or rather to Europeans. There need be no objection to territorial designation, or even to a group of persons having a club for themselves, and not approving of outsiders joining it. But this designation is derived from the old British habit of considering that they are the real India that counts, the real Bengal, the real Allahabad. Others are just excrescences, useful in their own way, if they know their places, but otherwise a nuisance. The exclusion of non-Europeans is far more a racial affair than a justifiable means for people with cultural affinities to meet together in their leisure moments for play and social intercourse, without the intrusion of other elements. For my part, I have no objection to exclusive English or European clubs, and very few Indians would care to join them, but when this social exclusiveness is clearly based on racialism and on a ruling class always exhibiting its superiority and unapproachability, it bears another aspect. In Bombay, there is a well-known club which did not allow and so far as I know, does not allow, an Indian, except as a servant, even in its visitor's room, even though he might be a ruling prince or a captain of industry. Racialism in India is not so much English versus Indian, it is European as opposed to Asiatic. In India, every European, be he German, or Pole, or Romanian, is automatically a member of the ruling race. Railway carriages, station retiring rooms, benches in parks, etc., are marked for Europeans only. This is bad enough in South Africa or elsewhere, but to have to put up with it in one's own country is a humiliating and exasperating reminder of one's enslaved condition. It is true that a gradual change has been taking place in these external manifestations of racial superiority and imperial arrogance, but the process is slow and frequent instances occur to show how superficial it is. Political pressure, and the rise of a militant nationalism, enforce change and lead to a deliberate attempt to tone down the former racialism and aggressiveness, and yet that very political movement, when it reaches a stage of crisis and is sought to be crushed, leads to a resurgence of all the old imperialist and racial arrogance in its extremist form. The English are a sensitive people, and yet when they go to foreign countries there is a strange lack of awareness about them. In India, where the relation of ruler and ruled makes mutual understanding difficult, this lack of awareness is peculiarly evident. Almost one would think that it is deliberate, so that they may see only what they want to see, and be blind to all else, but facts do not vanish because they are ignored, and when they compel attention there is a feeling of displeasure and resentment at the unexpected happening, as of some trick having been played. In this land of caste, the British, and more especially the Indian civil service, have built up a caste which is rigid and exclusive. Even the Indian members of the service do not really belong to that caste, though they wear the insignia and conform to its rules. That caste has developed something in the nature of a religious faith in its own paramount importance, and round that faith has grown an appropriate mythology which helps to maintain it. A combination of faith and vested interests is a powerful one, and any challenge to it arouses the deepest passions and fierce indignation. End of Part 1, titled, Consolidation of British Rule and Rise of Nationalist Movement, The Ideology of Empire, The New Caste, of Chapter 7. Part 2, The Plunder of Bengal Helps the Industrial Revolution in England. The East India Company had received permission from the Mughal Emperor to start a factory at Surat, early in the 17th century. Some years later, they purchased a patch of land in the south and founded Madras. In 1662, the island of Bombay was presented to Charles II of England by way of dowry from Portugal, and he transferred it to the company. In 1690 the city of Calcutta was founded. Thus, by the end of the 17th century, the British had gained a number of footholds in India and established some bridgeheads on the Indian coastline. They spread inland slowly. The Battle of Plassey in 1757 for the first time brought a vast area under their control, and within a few years Bengal, Bihar, Orissa, and the east coast were subject to them. The next big step forward was taken about 40 years later, at the beginning of the 19th century. This brought them to the gates of Delhi. The third major advance took place after the last defeat of the Marathas in 1818, the fourth in 1849, after the Sikh Wars, completed the picture. Thus, the British have been in the city of Madras a little over 300 years, they have ruled Bengal, Bihar, etc., for 187 years, they extended their domination over the south 145 years ago, they established themselves in the United Provinces, as they are now called, central and western India about 125 years ago, and they spread to the Punjab 95 years ago. This is being written in June 1944, leaving out the city of Madras as too small an area. There is a difference of nearly 100 years between their occupation of Bengal and that of the Punjab. During this period, British policy and administrative methods changed repeatedly. These changes were dictated by new developments in England, as well as the consolidation of British rule in India. The treatment of each newly acquired area varied according to these changes, and depended also on the character of the ruling group which had been defeated by the British. Thus, in Bengal, where the victory had been very easy, the Muslim landed gentry were looked upon as the ruling classes, and a policy was pursued to break their power. In the Punjab, on the other hand, power was seized from the Sikhs, and there was no initial antagonism between the British and the Muslims. In the greater part of India, the Marathas had been opponents of the British. A significant fact which stands out is that those parts of India which have been longest under British rule are the poorest today. Indeed, some kind of chart might be drawn up to indicate the close connection between length of British rule and progressive growth of poverty. A few large cities, and some new industrial areas, do not make any essential difference to this survey. What is noteworthy is the condition of the masses as a whole, and there can be no doubt that the poorest parts of India are Bengal, Bihar, Orissa, and parts of the Madras Presidency. The mass level and standards of living are highest in the Punjab. Bengal certainly was a very rich and prosperous province before the British came. There may be many reasons for these contrasts and differences. But it is difficult to get over the fact that Bengal, once so rich and flourishing, after 187 years of British rule, accompanied, as we are told, by strenuous attempts on the part of the British to improve its condition and to teach its people the art of self-government, is today a miserable mass of poverty-stricken, starving, and dying people. Bengal had the first full experience of British rule in India. That rule began with outright plunder, and a land revenue system which extracted the uttermost farthing not only from the living but also from the dead cultivators. The English historians of India, Edward Thompson and G.T. Garrett, tell us that a gold lust unequaled since the hysteria that took hold of the Spaniards of Cortes and Pizarro's age filled the English mind. Bengal in particular was not to know peace again, until she has been bled white. For the monstrous financial immorality of the English conduct in India for many a year after this, Clive was largely responsible. Footnote: Rise and Fulfillment of British Rule in India by Edward Thompson and G.T. Garrett, London, 1935. End of footnote. Clive, the great empire builder, whose statue faces the India Office in London today. It was pure loot. The pagoda tree was shaken again and again till the most terrible famines ravaged Bengal. This process was called trade later on, but that made little difference. Government was this so-called trade, and trade was plunder. There are few instances in history of anything like it. And it must be remembered that this lasted, under various names and under different forms, not for a few years but for generations. The outright plunder gradually took the shape of legalized exploitation, which, though not so obvious, was in reality worse. The corruption, venality, nepotism, violence, and greed of money of these early generations of British rule in India is something which passes comprehension. It is significant that one of the Hindustani words which has become part of the English language is loot. Says Edward Thompson, and this does not refer to Bengal only, one remembers the early history of British India, which is perhaps the world's high-water mark of graft. The result of all this, even in its early stages, was the famine of 1770, which swept away over a third of the population of Bengal and Bihar. But it was all in the cause of progress, and Bengal can take pride in the fact that she helped greatly in giving birth to the Industrial Revolution in England. The American writer, Brooke Adams, tells us exactly how this happened. The influx of Indian treasure, by adding considerably to the nation's cash capital, not only increased its stock of energy, but added much to its flexibility and the rapidity of its movement. Very soon after Plassey, the Bengal plunder began to arrive in London, and the effect appears to have been instantaneous, for all authorities agree that the Industrial Revolution began with the year 1770. Plassey was fought in 1757, and probably nothing has ever equaled the rapidity of the change that followed. In 1760 the flying shuttle appeared, and coal began to replace wood in smelting. In 1764 Hargreaves invented the spinning jenny, in 1776 Grompton contrived the mule, in 1785 Cartwright patented the power loom, and in 1768 Watt matured the steam engine. But though these machines served as outlets for the accelerating movements of the time, they did not cause the acceleration. In themselves, inventions are passive, waiting for a sufficient store of force to have accumulated to set them working. That store must always take the shape of money, and money not hoarded but in motion. Before the influx of the Indian treasure, and the expansion of credit which followed, no force sufficient for this purpose existed. Possibly since the world began, no investment has ever yielded the profit reaped from the Indian plunder, because for nearly 50 years Great Britain stood without a competitor. Footnote: Brooke Adams, The Law of Civilization in Decay, 1928, pages 259 to 260, quoted by Kate Mitchell in India, 1943. End of footnote. End of Part 2, titled, The Plunder of Bengal Helps the Industrial Revolution in England, of Chapter 7. Part 3, The Destruction of India's Industry and the Decay of her Agriculture. The chief business of the East India Company in its early period, the very object for which it was started, was to carry Indian manufactured goods, textiles, etc., as well as spices and the like from the East to Europe, where there was a great demand for these articles. With the developments in industrial techniques in England, a new class of industrial capitalists rose there, demanding a change in this policy. The British market was to be closed to Indian products, and the Indian market open to British manufactures. The British Parliament, influenced by this new class, began to take a greater interest in India and the working of the East India Company. To begin with, Indian goods were excluded from Britain by legislation, and as the East India Company held a monopoly in the Indian export business, this exclusion influenced other foreign markets also. This was followed by vigorous attempts to restrict and crush Indian manufactures by various measures and internal duties which prevented the flow of Indian goods within the country itself. British goods meanwhile had free entry. The Indian textile industry collapsed, affecting vast numbers of weavers and artisans. The process was rapid in Bengal and Bihar. Elsewhere, it spread gradually with the expansion of British rule and the building of railways. It continued throughout the 19th century, breaking up other old industries also, shipbuilding, metalworking, glass, paper, and many crafts. To some extent, this was inevitable as the older manufacturing came into conflict with the new industrial technique. But it was hastened by political and economic pressure, and no attempt was made to apply the new techniques to India. Indeed, every attempt was made to prevent this happening, and thus the economic development of India was arrested, and the growth of the new industry prevented. Machinery could not be imported into India. A vacuum was created, which could only be filled by British goods, and which led to rapidly increasing unemployment and poverty. The classic type of modern colonial economy was built up, India becoming an agricultural colony of industrial England, supplying raw materials, and providing markets for England's industrial goods. The liquidation of the artisan class led to unemployment on a prodigious scale. What were all these scores of millions, who had so far been engaged in industry and manufacture, to do now? Where were they to go? Their old profession was no longer open to them, the way to a new one was barred. They could die, of course, that way of escape from an intolerable situation is always open. They did die in tens of millions. The English Governor-General of India, Lord Bentinck, reported in 1834 that the misery hardly finds a parallel in the history of commerce. The bones of the cotton weavers are bleaching the plains of India. But still vast numbers of them remained, and these increased from year to year, as British policy affected remoter areas of the country and created more unemployment. All these hordes of artisans and craftsmen had no job, no work, and all their ancient skill was useless. They drifted to the land, for the land was still there. But the land was fully occupied, and could not possibly absorb them profitably. So they became a burden on the land, and the burden grew, and with it grew the poverty of the country, and the standard of living fell to incredibly low levels. This compulsory back to the land movement of artisans and craftsmen led to an ever-growing disproportion between agriculture and industry. Agriculture became more and more the sole business of the people because of the lack of occupations and wealth-producing activities. India became progressively ruralized. In every progressive country there has been, during the past century, a shift of population from agriculture to industry, from village to town. In India this process was reversed, as a result of British policy. The figures are instructive and significant. In the middle of the 19th century, about 55% of the population is said to have been dependent on agriculture. Recently this proportion was estimated to be 74%. This is a pre-war figure, though there has been greater industrial employment during the war. The number of those dependent on agriculture actually went up in the census of 1941, owing to increase of population. The growth of a few large cities, chiefly at the expense of the small town, is apt to mislead the superficial observer and give him a false idea of Indian conditions. This then is the fundamental, cause of the appalling poverty of the Indian people, and it is of comparatively recent origin. Other causes that contribute to it are themselves the result of this poverty and chronic starvation and undernourishment, like disease and illiteracy. Excessive population is unfortunate, and steps should be taken to curb it wherever necessary, but it still compares favorably with the density of population of many industrialized countries. It is only excessive for a predominantly agricultural community, and under a proper economic system, the entire population can be made productive and should add to the wealth of the country. As a matter of fact, great density of population exists only in special areas, like Bengal and the Gangetic Valley, and vast areas are still sparsely populated. It is worth remembering that Great Britain is more than twice as densely populated as India. The crisis in industry spread rapidly to the land, and became a permanent crisis in agriculture. Holdings became smaller, and fragmentation proceeded to an absurd and fantastic degree. The burden of agricultural debt grew and ownership of the land often passed to moneylenders. The number of landless laborers increased by the million. India was under an industrial capitalist regime, but her economy was largely that of the pre-capitalist period, minus many of the wealth-producing elements of that pre-capitalist economy. She became a passive agent of modern industrial capitalism, suffering all its ills and with hardly any of its advantages. The transition from a pre-industrialist economy to an economy of capitalist industrialism involves great hardship and heavy cost and human suffering borne by masses of people. This was especially so in the early days when no efforts were made to plan such a transition or to lessen its evil results, and everything was left to individual initiative. There was this hardship in England during the period of transition, but taken as a whole, it was not great as the changeover was rapid and the unemployment caused was soon absorbed by the new industries. But that did not mean that the cost in human suffering was not paid. It was indeed paid, and paid in full by others, particularly by the people of India, by famine and death and vast unemployment. It may be said that a great part of the costs of transition to industrialism in Western Europe were paid for by India, China, and the other colonial countries, whose economy was dominated by the European powers. It is obvious that there has been all along abundant material in India for industrial development, managerial and technical ability, skilled workers, even some capital in spite of the continuous drain from India. The historian, Montgomery Martin, giving evidence before an inquiry committee of the British Parliament in 1840, said, "India is as much a manufacturing country as an agriculturist, and he who would seek to reduce her to the position of an agricultural country, seeks to lower her in the scale of civilization." That is exactly what the British, in India sought to do, continuously and persistently, and the measure of their success is the present condition of India, after they have held despotic sway there for a century and a half. Ever since the demand for the development of modern industry arose in India, and this, I imagine, is at least 100 years old, we have been told that India is preeminently an agricultural country and it is in her interest to stick to agriculture. Industrial development may upset the balance, and prove harmful to her main business, agriculture. The solicitude which British industrialists and economists have shown for the Indian peasant has been truly gratifying. In view of this, as well as of the tender care lavished upon him by the British government in India, one can only conclude that some all-powerful and malign fate, some supernatural agency, has countered their intentions and measures, and made that peasant one of the poorest and most miserable beings on earth. It is difficult now for anyone to oppose industrial development in India, but even now, when any extensive and far-reaching plan is drawn up, we are warned by our British friends, who continue to shower their advice upon us, that agriculture must not be neglected and must have first place. As if any Indian with an iota of intelligence can ignore or neglect agriculture or forget the peasant. The Indian peasant is India more than anyone else, and it is on his progress and betterment that India's progress will depend. But our crisis in agriculture, grave as it is interlinked with the crisis in industry, out of which it arose. The two cannot be disconnected and dealt with separately, and it is essential for the disproportion between the two to be remedied. India's ability to develop modern industry can be seen by her success in it whenever she has had the chance to build it up. Indeed, such success has been achieved in spite of the strenuous opposition of the British government in India and of vested interests in Britain. Her first real chance came during the War of 1914–18, when the inflow of British goods was interrupted. She profited by it, though only to a relatively small extent because of British policy. Ever since then, there has been continuous pressure on the government to facilitate the growth of Indian industry by removing the various barriers and special interests that come in the way. While apparently accepting this as its policy, the government has obstructed all real growth, especially of basic industries. Even in the Constitution Act of 1935 it was specifically laid down that Indian legislatures could not interfere with the vested interests of British industry in India. The pre-war years witnessed repeated and vigorous attempts to build up basic and heavy industries, all scotched by official policy. But the most amazing instances of official obstruction have been during the present war, when war needs for production were paramount. Even those vital needs were not sufficient to overcome British dislike of Indian industry. That industry has grown because of the force of events, but its growth is trivial compared to what it could have been or to the growth of industry in many other countries. The direct opposition of the earlier periods to the growth of Indian industry gave place to indirect methods, which have been equally effective, just as direct tribute gave place to manipulation of customs and excise duties and financial and currency policies, which benefited Britain at the expense of India. Long subjection of a people and the denial of freedom bring many evils, and perhaps the greatest of these lies in the spiritual sphere, demoralization and sapping of the spirit of the people. It is hard to measure this, though it may be obvious. It is easier to trace and measure the economic decay of a nation, and as we look back on British economic policy in India, it seems that the present poverty of the Indian people is the ineluctable consequence of it. There is no mystery about this poverty, we can see the causes and follow the processes which have led to the present condition. End of Part 3, titled, The Destruction of India's Industry and the Decay of Her Agriculture, of Chapter 7. Part 4, India becomes for the first time a political and economic appendage of another country. The establishment of British rule in India was an entirely novel phenomenon for her, not comparable with any other invasion or political or economic change. India had been conquered before, but by invaders who settled within her frontiers and made themselves part of her life. Like the Normans in England or the Manchus in China, she had never lost her independence, never been enslaved. That is to say, she had never been drawn into a political and economic system, whose center of gravity lay outside her soil, never been subjected to a ruling class, which was, and which remained, permanently alien in origin and character. Footnote, K.S. Shelvingkers, The Problem of India, published by Penguin Special, London, 1940. End of footnote. Every previous ruling class, whether it had originally come from outside, or was indigenous, had accepted the structural unity of India's social and economic life, and tried to fit into it. It had become Indianized, and had struck roots in the soil of the country. The new rulers were entirely different, with their base elsewhere, and between them and the average Indian there was a vast and unbridgeable gulf, a difference in tradition, in outlook, in income, and ways of living. The early Britishers in India, rather cut off from England, adopted many Indian ways of living. But it was a superficial approach, and even this was deliberately abandoned with the improvement in communications between India and England. It was felt that the British ruling class must maintain its prestige in India, by keeping aloof, exclusive, apart from Indians, living in a superior world of its own. There were two worlds, the world of British officials, and the world of India's millions, and there was nothing in common between them except a common dislike for each other. Previously races had merged into one another, or at least fitted into an organically interdependent structure. Now racialism became the acknowledged creed, and this was intensified by the fact that the dominant race had both political and economic power, without check or hindrance. The world market, that the new capitalism was building up would have, in any event, affected India's economic system. The self-sufficient village community, with its traditional division of labor, could not have continued in its old form. But the change that took place was not a normal development, and it disintegrated the whole economic and structural basis of Indian society. A system which had social sanctions and controls behind it, and was a part of the people's cultural heritage, was suddenly and forcibly changed, and another system, administered from outside the group, was imposed. India did not come into a world market, but became a colonial and agricultural appendage of the British structure. The village community, which had so far been the basis of Indian economy, was disintegrated, losing both its economic and administrative functions. In 1830, Sir Charles Metcalfe, one of the ablest of British officials in India, described these communities in words which have often been quoted: "The village communities are little republics, having nearly everything they want within themselves, and almost independent of foreign relations. They seem to last where nothing else lasts." This union of the village communities, each one forming a separate little state in itself, is in a high degree conducive to their happiness, and to the enjoyment of a great portion of freedom and independence. The destruction of village industries was a powerful blow to these communities. The balance between industry and agriculture was upset, the traditional division of labor was broken up, and numerous stray individuals could not be easily fitted into any group activity. A more direct blow came from the introduction of the landlord system, changing the whole conception of ownership of land. This conception had been one of communal ownership, not so much of the land as of the produce of the land. Possibly not fully appreciating this, but more probably taking the step deliberately for reasons of their own, the British governors, themselves representing the English landlord class, introduced something resembling the English system in India. At first, they appointed revenue farmers for short terms, that is, persons who were made responsible for the collection of the revenue or land tax and payment of it to the government. Later, these revenue farmers developed into landlords. The village community was deprived of all control over the land and its produce. What had always been considered as the chief interest and concern of that community now became the private property of the newly created landowner. This led to the breakdown of the joint life and corporate character of the community, and the cooperative system of services and functions began to disappear gradually. The introduction of this type of property and land was not only a great economic change, but it went deeper and struck at the whole Indian conception of a cooperative group social structure. A new class, the owners of land, appeared, a class created by, and therefore to a large extent identified with, the British government. The breakup of the old system created new problems, and probably the beginnings of the new Hindu-Muslim problem can be traced to it. The landlord system was first introduced in Bengal and Bihar, where big landowners were created under the system, known as the permanent settlement. It was later realized that this was not advantageous to the state, as the land revenue had been fixed, and could not be enhanced. Fresh settlements in other parts of India were therefore made for a period only, and enhancements in revenue took place from time to time. In some provinces a kind of peasant proprietorship was established. The extreme rigor applied to the collection of revenue resulted, especially in Bengal, in the ruin of the old landed gentry, and new people from the moneyed and business classes took their place. Thus, Bengal became a province predominantly of Hindu landlords, while their tenants, though both Hindu and Muslim, were chiefly the latter. Big landowners were created by the British after their own English pattern, chiefly because it was far easier to deal with a few individuals than with a vast peasantry. The objective was to collect as much money in the shape of revenue, and as speedily as possible. If an owner failed at the stipulated time, he was immediately pushed out and another took his place. It was also considered necessary to create a class whose interests were identified with the British. The fear of revolt filled the minds of British officials in India, and they referred to this repeatedly in their papers. Governor-General Lord William Bentinck said in 1829, "If security was wanting against extensive popular tumult or revolution, I should say that the permanent settlement, though a failure in many other respects, has this great advantage at least, of having created a vast body of rich landed proprietors deeply interested in the continuance of British dominion and having complete command over the mass of the people." British rule thus consolidated itself by creating new classes and vested interests, which were tied up with that rule, and privileges, which depended on its continuance. There were the landowners and the princes, and there was a large number of subordinate members of the services in various departments of government, from the patwari, the village headman, upwards. The two essential branches of government were the revenue system and the police. At the head of both of these in each district was the collector or district magistrate, who was the linchpin of the administration. He functioned as an autocrat in his district, combining in himself executive, judicial, revenue, and police functions. If there were any small Indian states adjoining the area under his control, he was also the British agent for them. Then there was the Indian Army, consisting of British and Indian troops, but officered entirely by Englishmen. This was reorganized repeatedly, especially after the Mutiny of 1857, and ultimately became organizationally linked up with the British Army. This was so arranged as to balance its different elements and keep the British troops in key positions. Next to the grand counterpoise of a sufficient European force comes the counterpoise of natives against natives, says the official report on reorganization in 1858. The primary function of these forces was to serve as an army of occupation, internal security troops they were called, and a majority of these was British. The frontier province served as a training ground for the British Army at India's expense. The field army, chiefly Indian, was meant for service abroad, and it took part in numerous British imperial wars and expeditions, India always bearing the cost. Steps were taken to segregate Indian troops from the rest of the population. Thus, India had to bear the cost of her own conquest, and then of her transfer, or sale, from the East India Company to the British Crown, for the extension of the British Empire to Burma and elsewhere, for expeditions to Africa, Persia, etc., and for her defense against Indians themselves. She was not only used as a base for imperial purposes, without any reimbursement for this, but she had further to pay for the training of part of the British Army in England, capitation charges, these were called. Indeed, India was charged for all manner of other expenses incurred by Britain, such as the maintenance of British diplomatic and consular establishments in China and Persia, the entire cost of the telegraph line from England to India, part of the expenses of the British Mediterranean fleet, and even the receptions given to the Sultan of Turkey in London. The building of railways in India, undoubtedly desirable and necessary, was done in an enormously wasteful way. The government of India guaranteed 5% interest on all capital invested, and there was no need to check or estimate what was necessary. All purchases were made in England. The civil establishment of government was also run on a lavish and extravagant scale, all the highly paid positions being reserved for Europeans. The process of Indianization of the administrative machine was very slow, and only became noticeable in the 20th century. This process, far from transferring any power to Indian hands, proved yet another method of strengthening British rule. The really key positions remained in British hands, and Indians in the administration could only function as the agents of British rule. To all these methods must be added the deliberate policy, pursued throughout the period of British rule, or creating divisions among Indians, of encouraging one group at the cost of another. This policy was openly admitted in the early days of their rule, and indeed it was a natural one for an imperial power. With the growth of the nationalist movement, that policy took subtler and more dangerous forms, and though denied, functioned more intensively than ever. Nearly all our major problems today have grown up during British rule and as a direct result of British policy: the princes, the minority problem, various vested interests, foreign and Indian, the lack of industry and the neglect of agriculture, the extreme backwardness in the social services, and, above all, the tragic poverty of the people. The attitude to education has been significant. In Kay's Life of Metcalfe, it is stated that this dread of the free diffusion of knowledge became a chronic disease, continually afflicting the members of government with all sorts of hypochondriacal daydreams and nightmares, in which visions of the printing press and the Bible were making their flesh creep, and their hair to stand erect with horror. It was our policy in those days to keep the natives of India in the profoundest state of barbarism and darkness, and every attempt to diffuse the light of knowledge among the people, either of our own or of the independent states, was vehemently opposed and resented. Footnote, quoted by Edward Thompson in the Life of Lord Metcalfe. End of footnote. Imperialism must function in this way, or else it ceases to be imperialism. The modern type of finance imperialism added new kinds of economic exploitation, which were unknown in earlier ages. The record of British rule in India during the 19th century must necessarily depress and anger an Indian, and yet it illustrates the superiority of the British in many fields, not least in their capacity to profit by our disunity and weaknesses. A people who are weak and who are left behind in the march of time invite trouble, and ultimately have only themselves to blame. If British imperialism with all its consequences was, in the circumstances, to be expected in the natural order of events, so also was the growth of opposition to it inevitable, and the final crisis between the two. End of Part 4, titled, India Becomes for the First Time a Political and Economic Appendage of Another Country, of Chapter 7. Part 5, The Growth of the Indian States System. One of our major problems in India today is that of the princes of the Indian states. These states are unique of their kind in the world, and they vary greatly in size and political and social conditions. Their number is 601. About 15 of these may be considered major states, the biggest of these being Hyderabad, Kashmir, Mysore, Travancore, Baroda, Gwalior, Indore, Cochin, Jaipur, Jodhpur, Bikaner, Bhopal, and Patiala. Then follow a number of middling states, and lastly, several hundreds of very small areas, some not bigger than a pin's point on the map. Most of these tiny states are in Cote d'Ivoire, Western India, and the Punjab. These states not only vary in size from that of France to almost that of an average farmer's holding, but also differ in every other way. Mysore is industrially the most advanced. Mysore, Travancore, and Cochin are educationally far ahead of British India. Footnote: Travancore, Cochin, Mysore, and Baroda are, from the point of view of popular education, far in advance of British India. In Travancore, it is interesting to note that popular education began to be organized in 1801. Compare England, where it started in 1870. The literacy percentage in Travancore is now 58 for men and 41 for women. This is over 4 times higher than the British India percentage. Public health is also better organized in Travancore. Women play an important part in public service and activities in Travancore. End of footnote. Most of the states are, however, very backward, and some are completely feudal. All of them are autocracies, though some have started elected councils whose powers are strictly limited. Hyderabad, the premier state, still carries on with the typical feudal regime, supported by an almost complete denial of civil liberties. So also most of the states in Rajputana and the Punjab. A lack of civil liberties is a common feature of the states. These states do not form compact blocks, they are spread out all over India, islands surrounded by non-state areas. The vast majority of them are totally unable to support even a semi-independent economy. Even the largest, situated as they are, can hardly hope to do so without the full cooperation of the surrounding areas. If there was any economic conflict between a state and non-state India, the former could be easily reduced to submission by tariff barriers and other economic sanctions. It is manifest that both politically and economically these states, even the largest of them, cannot be separated and treated as independent entities. As such, they would not survive, and the rest of India would also suffer greatly. They would become hostile enclaves all over India, and if they relied on some external power for protection, this in itself would be a continuous and serious menace to a free India. Indeed, they would not have survived till today, but for the fact that politically and economically the whole of India, including the states, is under one dominant power which protects them. Apart from the possible conflicts between a state and non-state India, it must be remembered that there is continuous pressure on the autocratic ruler of the state from his own people, who demand free institutions. Attempts to achieve this freedom are suppressed and kept back with the aid of the British power. Even in the 19th century, these states, as constituted, became anachronisms. Under modern conditions, it is impossible to conceive of India being split up into scores of separate independent entities. Not only would there be perpetual conflict, but all planned economic and cultural progress would become impossible. We must remember that when these states took shape and entered into treaties with the East India Company, at the beginning of the 19th century, Europe was divided up into numerous small principalities. Many wars and revolutions have changed the face of Europe since then, and are changing it today, but the face of India was set and petrified by external pressure imposed upon it, and not allowed to change. It seems absurd to hold up some treaty drawn up 140 years ago, usually on the field of battle or immediately afterwards, between two rival commanders or their chiefs, and to say that this temporary settlement must last forever. The people of the state of course had no say in that settlement, and the other party at the time was a commercial corporation concerned only with its own interests and profits. This commercial corporation, the East India Company, acted not as the agent of the British Crown or Parliament, but in theory, as the agent of the Delhi Emperor, from whom power and authority were supposed to flow, although he was himself quite powerless. The British Crown or Parliament had nothing whatever to do with these treaties. Parliament only considered Indian affairs when the charter of the East India Company came up for discussion from time to time. The fact that the East India Company was functioning in India under the authority conferred on it by the Divani grant of the Mughal Emperor made it independent of any direct interference by the British Crown or Parliament. Indirectly, Parliament could, if it so chose, cancel the charter or impose new conditions at the time of renewal. The idea that the English king or parliament should even in theory function as agents and therefore as subordinates of the shadowy emperor at Delhi was not liked in England, and so they studiously kept aloof from the activities of the East India Company. The money spent in the Indian Wars was Indian money raised and disposed of by the East India Company. Subsequently, as the territory under the control of the East India Company increased in area and its rule was consolidated, the British Parliament began to take greater interest in Indian affairs. In 1858, after the shock of the Indian Mutiny and Revolt, the East India Company transferred its domain of India, for money paid by India, to the British Crown. That transfer did not involve a separate transfer of the Indian states apart from the rest of India. The whole of India was treated as a unit and the British Parliament functioned in India through the Government of India, which exercised a suzerainty over the states. The states had no separate relations with the British Crown or Parliament. They were part and parcel of the system of government, direct and indirect, represented by the Government of India. This government, in later years, ignored those old treaties whenever it suited its changing policy to do so, and exercised a very effective suzerainty over the states. Thus, the British Crown was not in the picture at all so far as the Indian states were concerned. It is only in recent years that the claim to some kind of independence has been raised on behalf of the states, and it has been further claimed that they have some special relations with the British Crown, apart from the Government of India. These treaties, it should be noted, are with very few of the states. There are only 40 treaty states, the rest have engagements and synods. These 40 states have 3/4 of the total Indian state population, and 6 of them have considerably more than 1/3 of this population. Footnote, these 6 are, Hyderabad, 12 to 13 million, Mysore, 7.5 million, Travancore, 6.25 million, Baroda, 4 million, Kashmir, 3 million, Gwalior, 3 million, totaling over 36 million. The total Indian states population is about 90 million. End of footnote. In the Government of India Act of 1935, for the first time, some distinction was made between the relations of the states and the rest of India with the British Parliament. The states were removed from the supervisory authority in direction of the Government of India and placed directly under the Viceroy who, for this purpose, was called the Crown Representative. The Viceroy continued to be, at the same time, the head of the Government of India. The political department of the Government of India, which used to be responsible for the states, was now placed directly under the Viceroy, and was no longer under his executive council. How did these states come into existence? Some are quite new, created by the British, others were the viceroyalties of the Mughal emperor, and their rulers were permitted to continue as feudatory chiefs by the British, yet others, notably the Maratha chiefs, were defeated by British armies, and then made into feudatories. Nearly all these can be traced back to the beginnings of British rule, they have no earlier history. If some of them functioned independently for a while, that independence was of brief duration, and ended in defeat in war or threat of war. Only a few of the states, and these are chiefly in Rajputana, date back to pre-Mughal times. Travancore has an ancient, 1,000-year-old historical continuity. Some of the proud Rajput clans trace back their genealogy to prehistoric times. The Maharana of Udaipur, of the Suryavamsha or race of the sun, has a family tree comparable to that of the Mikado of Japan. But these Rajput chiefs became Mughal feudatories, and then submitted to the Marathas, and finally to the British. The representatives of the East India Company, writes Edward Thompson, now set the princes in their positions, lifting them out of the chaos in which they were submerged. When thus picked up, and re-established, the princes were as completely helpless and derelict as any powers since the beginning of the world. Had the British government not intervened, nothing but extinction lay before the Rajput states, and disintegration before the Maratha states. As for such states as Awadh and the Nizam's dominions, their very existence was bogus, they were kept in a semblance of life, only by means of the breath blown through them by the protecting power. Footnote, The Making of the Indian Princes, Edward Thompson, pages 270 to 271. In this book, as well as Thompson's Life of Lord Metcalfe, there are vivid pictures of Hyderabad and British control and graft there, also of Delhi and Ranjit Singh's Punjab. The Butler Committee, 1928-29, appointed by the British government to consider the problem of the Indian states, said in its report, it is not in accordance with historical facts that when the Indian states came into contact with the British power, they were independent. Some were rescued, others were created by the British. End of footnote. Hyderabad, the premier state today, was small, in area to begin with. Its boundaries were extended twice, after Tipu Sultan's defeat by the British, and the Maratha Wars. These additions were at the instance of the British, and on the express stipulation that the Nizam was to function in a subordinate capacity to them. Indeed, on Tipu's defeat, the offer of part of his territory was first made to the Peshwa, the Maratha leader, but he refused to accept it on those conditions. Kashmir, the next largest state, was sold by the East India Company after the Sikh Wars to the great-grandfather of the present ruler. It was subsequently taken under direct British control on a plea of misgovernment. Later, the ruler's powers were restored to them. The present state of Mysore was created by the British after Tipu's wars. It was also under direct British rule for a lengthy period. The only truly independent kingdom in India is Nepal on the northeastern frontier, which occupies a position analogous to that of Afghanistan, though it is rather isolated. All the rest came within the scope of what was called the subsidiary system, under which all real power lay with the British government, exercised through a resident or agent. Often even the ministers of the ruler were British officials imposed upon him. But the entire responsibility for good government and reform lay with the ruler, who with the best will in the world, and he usually lacked that will as well as competence, could do little in the circumstances. Henry Lawrence wrote in 1846 about the Indian states system: if there was a device for ensuring well government, it is that of a native ruler and minister both relying on foreign bayonets, and directed by a British resident. Even if all these were able, virtuous, and considerate, still the wheels of government could hardly move smoothly. If it be difficult to select one man, European or native, with all the requisites of a just administrator, where are three who can or will work together to be found? Each of the three may work incalculable mischief, but no one of them can do good if thwarted by the other. Earlier still, in 1817, Sir Thomas Munro wrote to the Governor-General, "There are many weighty objections to the employment of a subsidiary force. It has a natural tendency to render the government of every country in which it exists weak and oppressive, to extinguish all honorable spirit among the higher classes of society, and to degrade and impoverish the whole people. The usual remedy of a bad government in India is a quiet revolution in the palace, or a violent one by rebellion or foreign conquests. But the presence of a British force cuts off every chance of remedy, by supporting the prince on the throne against every foreign and domestic enemy. It renders him indolent, by teaching him to trust to strangers for his security, and cruel and avaricious, by showing him that he has nothing to fear from the hatred of his subjects. Wherever the subsidiary system is introduced, unless the reigning prince be a man of great abilities, the country will soon bear the marks of it in decaying villages and decreasing population. Even if the prince himself were disposed to adhere rigidly to the British alliance, there will always be some amongst his principal officers who will urge him to break it. As long as there remains in the country any high-minded independence, which seeks to throw off the control of strangers, such counsellors will be found. I have a better opinion of the natives of India than to think that this spirit will ever be completely extinguished, and I can therefore have no doubt that the subsidiary system must everywhere run its full course and destroy every government which it undertakes to protect." Footnote, quoted by Edward Thompson in The Making of the Indian Princes, 1943. End of footnote. In spite of such protests, the subsidiary Indian state system was built up, and it brought, inevitably, corruption and tyranny in its train. The governments of these states were often bad enough, but, in any event, they were almost powerless. A few of the British residents or agents in these states, like Metcalfe, were honest and conscientious, but more often they were neither, and they exercised the harlot's privilege of having power without responsibility. Private English adventurers, secure in the knowledge of their race and of official backing, played havoc with the funds of the state. Some of the accounts of what took place in these states during the first half of the 19th century, especially in Awadh and Hyderabad, are almost incredible. Awadh was annexed to British India a little before the Mutiny of 1857. British policy was then in favour of such annexations, and every pretext was taken advantage of for a lapse of the state to British authority. But the Mutiny and Great Revolt of 1857 demonstrated the value of the subsidiary state system to the British government. Except for some minor defections, the Indian princes not only remained aloof from the rising, but, in some instances, actually helped the British to crush it. This brought about a change in British policy towards them, and it was decided to keep them and even to strengthen them. The doctrine of British paramountcy was proclaimed, and in practice the control of the political department of the Government of India over the states has been strict and continuous. Rulers have been removed or deprived of their powers, ministers have been imposed upon them from the British services. Quite a large number of such ministers are functioning now in the States, and they consider themselves answerable far more to British authority than to their nominal head, the Prince. Some of the princes are good, some are bad, even the good ones are thwarted and checked at every turn. As a class they are of necessity backward, feudal in outlook, and authoritarian in methods, except in their dealings with the British government, when they show a becoming subservience. Shale 1 Kerr has rightly called the Indian states Britain's fifth column in India. End of Part 5, titled, The Growth of the Indian States System, of Chapter 7. Part 6, Contradictions of British Rule in India, Ram Mohan Roy, The Press, Sir William Jones, English Education in Bengal. One remarkable contradiction meets us at every turn in considering the record of British rule in India. The British became dominant in India, and the foremost power in the world, because they were the heralds of the new big machine industrial civilization. They represented a new historic force, which was going to change the world, and were thus, unknown to themselves, the forerunners and representatives of change and revolution, and yet they deliberately tried to prevent change, except in so far as this was necessary to consolidate their position, and help them in exploiting the country and its people to their own advantage. Their outlook and objectives were reactionary, partly because of the background of the social class that came here, but chiefly because of a deliberate desire to check changes in a progressive direction, as these might strengthen the Indian people, and thus, ultimately weaken the British hold on India. The fear of the people runs through all their thought and policy, for they did not want to and could not merge with them, and were destined to remain an isolated foreign ruling group, surrounded by an entirely different and hostile humanity. Changes, and some in a progressive direction, did come, but they came in spite of British policy, although their impetus was the impact of the New West through the British. Individual Englishmen, educationists, Orientalists, journalists, missionaries, and others played an important part in bringing Western culture to India, and in their attempts to do so often came into conflict with their own government. That government feared the effects of the spread of modern education, and put many obstacles in its way, and yet it was due to the pioneering efforts of able and earnest Englishmen, who gathered enthusiastic groups of Indian students around them, that English thought and literature and political tradition were introduced to India. When I say Englishmen, I include, of course, people from the whole of Great Britain and Ireland, though I know this is improper and incorrect. But I dislike the word Britisher, and even that probably does not include the Irish. My apologies to the Irish, the Scots, and the Welsh. In India they have all functioned alike and have been looked upon as one indistinguishable group. Even the British government, in spite of its dislike of education, was compelled by circumstances to arrange for the training and production of clerks for its growing establishment. It could not afford to bring out from England large numbers of people to serve in this subordinate capacity. So education grew slowly, and though it was a limited and perverted education, it opened the doors and windows of the mind to new ideas and dynamic thoughts. The printing press and indeed all machinery were also considered dangerous and explosive for the Indian mind, not to be encouraged in any way lest they led to the spread of sedition and industrial growth. There is a story that the Nizam of Hyderabad once expressed a desire to see European machinery, and thereupon, the British resident procured for him an air pump and a printing press. The Nizam's momentary curiosity having been satisfied, these were stored away with other gifts and curiosities. But when the government in Calcutta heard of this, they expressed their displeasure to their resident and rebuked him especially for introducing a printing press in an Indian state. The resident offered to get it broken up secretly if the government so desired. But while private printing presses were not encouraged, government could not carry on its work without printing, and official presses were therefore started in Calcutta and Madras and elsewhere. The first private printing press was started by the Baptist missionaries in Serampore, and the first newspaper was started by an Englishman in Calcutta in 1780. All these and other like changes crept in gradually, influencing the Indian mind and giving rise to the modern consciousness. Only a small group was directly influenced by the thought of Europe, for India clung to her own philosophic background, considering it superior to that of the West. The real impact and influence of the West were on the practical side of life, which was obviously superior to the Eastern. The new techniques, the railway train, the printing press, other machinery, more efficient ways of warfare, could not be ignored, and these came up against old methods of thought almost unawares, by indirect approaches, creating a conflict in the mind of India. The most obvious and far-reaching change was the breakup of the agrarian system and the introduction of conceptions of private property and landlordism. Money economy had crept in and land became a marketable commodity. What had once been held rigid by custom was dissolved by money. Bengal witnessed and experienced all these agrarian, technical, educational, and intellectual changes long before any other considerable part of India, for Bengal had a clear half-century of British rule before it spread over wider areas. During the second half of the 18th century and the first half of the 19th, Bengal therefore played a dominant role in British Indian life. Not only was Bengal the center and heart of the British administration, but it also produced the first groups of English-educated Indians who spread out to other parts of India under the shadow of the British power. A number of very remarkable men rose in Bengal in the 19th century, who gave the lead to the rest of India in cultural and political matters, and out of whose efforts the new nationalist movement ultimately took shape. Bengal not only had a much longer acquaintance with British rule, but it experienced it in its earliest phases when it was both harsher and more exuberant, more fluid and less set in rigid frames. It had accepted that rule, adapted itself to it, long before northern and central India submitted. The Great Revolt of 1857 had little effect on Bengal, although the first spark appeared accidentally at Barrackpore near Calcutta. Previous to British rule, Bengal had been an outlying province of the Mughal Empire, important but still rather cut off from the center. During the early medieval period, many debased forms of worship and of tantric philosophy and practices had flourished among the Hindus there. Then came many Hindu reform movements, affecting social customs and laws, and even changing somewhat the well-recognized rules of inheritance elsewhere. Chaitanya, a great scholar who became a man of faith and emotion, established a form of Vaishnavism, based on faith, and influenced greatly the people of Bengal. The Bengalis developed a curious mixture of high intellectual attainments and equally strong emotionalism. This tradition of loving faith and service of humanity was represented in Bengal in the second half of the 19th century by another remarkable man of saintly character, Ram Krishna Paramhans. In his name an order of service was established, which has an unequaled record in humanitarian relief and social work. Full of the ideal of the patient loving service of the Franciscans of old, and quiet, unostentatious, efficient, rather like the Quakers, the members of the Ram Krishna mission carry on their hospitals and educational establishments and engage in relief work, whenever any calamity occurs, all over India and even outside. Ram Krishna represented the old Indian tradition. Before him, in the 18th century, another towering personality had risen in Bengal, Raja Ram Mohan Roy, who was a new type combining in himself the old learning and the new. Deeply versed in Indian thought and philosophy, a scholar in Sanskrit, Persian, and Arabic, he was a product of the mixed Hindu-Muslim culture that was then dominant among the cultured classes of India. The coming of the British to India, and their superiority in many ways, led his curious and adventurous mind to find out what their cultural roots were. He learnt English, but this was not enough. He learnt Greek, Latin, and Hebrew also to discover the sources of the religion and culture of the West. He was also attracted by science and the technical aspects of Western civilization, though at that time these technical changes were not so obvious as they subsequently became. Being of a philosophical and scholarly bent, Ram Mohan Roy inevitably went to the older literatures. Describing him, Monier Williams, the Orientalist, has said that he was perhaps the first earnest-minded investigator of the science of comparative religion that the world has produced, and yet, at the same time, he was anxious to modernize education and take it out of the grip of the old scholasticism. Even in those early days he was in favor of the scientific method, and he wrote to the Governor-General emphasizing the need for education in mathematics, natural philosophy, chemistry, anatomy, and other useful sciences. He was more than a scholar and an investigator, he was a reformer above all. Influenced in his early days by Islam and later, to some extent, by Christianity, he stuck nevertheless to the foundations of his own faith. But he tried to reform that faith and rid it of abuses and the evil practices that had become associated with it. It was largely because of his agitation for the abolition of sati that the British government prohibited it. This sati, or the immolation of women on the funeral pyre of their husbands, was never widespread. But rare instances continued to occur among the upper classes. Probably the practice was brought to India originally by the Scytho-Tartars, among whom the custom prevailed of vassals and liegemen killing themselves on the death of their lord. In early Sanskrit literature, the sati custom is denounced. Akbar tried hard to stop it, and the Marathas also were opposed to it. Ram Mohan Roy was one of the founders of the Indian press. From 1780 onwards a number of newspapers had been published by Englishmen in India. These were usually very critical of the government, and led to conflict and the establishment of a strict censorship. Among the earliest champions of the freedom of the press in India were Englishmen, and one of them, James Silk Buckingham, who is still remembered, was deported from the country. The first Indian-owned and edited newspaper was issued, in English, in 1818, and in the same year the Baptist missionaries of Sirampur brought out a Bengali monthly and a weekly, the first periodicals published in an Indian language. Newspapers and periodicals in English and the Indian languages followed in quick succession in Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay. Meanwhile, the struggle for a free press had already begun, to continue with many ups and downs till today. The year 1818 also saw the birth of the famous Regulation 3, which provided for the first time for detention without trial. This regulation is still in force today, and a number of people are kept in prison under this 126-year-old decree. Ram Mohan Roy was associated with several newspapers. He brought out a bilingual, Bengali-English magazine, and later, desiring an all-India circulation, he published a weekly in Persian, which was recognized then as the language of the cultured classes all over India. But this came to grief soon after the enactment in 1823 of new measures for the control of the press. Ram Mohan and others protested vigorously against these measures and even addressed a petition to the King and Council in England. Ram Mohan Roy's journalist activities were intimately connected with his reform movements. His synthetic and universalist points of view were resented by orthodox sections, who also opposed many of the reforms he advocated. But he also had staunch supporters, among them the Tagore family, which played an outstanding part later in the Renaissance in Bengal. Ram Mohan went to England on behalf of the Delhi Emperor and died in Bristol in the early 30s of the 19th century. Ram Mohan Roy and others studied English privately. There were no English schools or colleges outside Calcutta, and the government's policy was definitely opposed to the teaching of English to Indians. In 1781, the Calcutta Madrasa was started by the government in Calcutta for Arabic studies. In 1817, a group of Indians and Europeans started the Hindu College in Calcutta, now called the Presidency College. In 1791, a Sanskrit college was started in Benares. Probably in the second decade of the 19th century, some missionary schools were teaching English. During the 20s, a school of thought arose in government circles in favor of the teaching of English, but this was opposed. However, as an experimental measure, some English classes were attached to the Arabic school in Delhi and to some institutions in Calcutta. The final decision in favor of the teaching of English was embodied in Macaulay's Minute on Education of February, 1835. In 1857, the universities of Calcutta, Madras and Bombay began their career. If the British government in India was reluctant to teach English to Indians, Brahmin scholars objected even more, but for different reasons, to teach Sanskrit to Englishmen. When Sir William Jones, already a linguist and a scholar, came to India as a judge of the Supreme Court, he expressed his desire to learn Sanskrit. But no Brahmin would agree to teach the sacred language to a foreigner and an intruder, even though handsome rewards were offered. Jones ultimately, with considerable difficulty, got hold of a non-Brahmin Vaidya or medical practitioner who agreed to teach, but on his own peculiar and stringent conditions. Jones agreed to every stipulation, so great was his eagerness to learn the ancient language of India. Sanskrit fascinated him, and especially the discovery of the old Indian drama. It was through his writings and translations that Europe first had a glimpse of some of the treasures of Sanskrit literature. In 1784, Sir William Jones established the Bengal Asiatic Society, which later became the Royal Asiatic Society. To Jones, and to the many other European scholars, India owes a deep debt of gratitude for the rediscovery of her past literature. Much of it was known, of course, throughout every age, but the knowledge had become more and more confined to select and exclusive groups, and the dominance of Persian, as the language of culture, had diverted people's minds from it. The search for manuscripts brought out many a little-known work, and the application of modern critical methods of scholarship gave a new background to the vast literature that was revealed. The advent and use of the printing press gave a great stimulus to the development of the popular Indian languages. Some of these languages, Hindi, Bengali, Gujarati, Marathi, Urdu, Tamil, Telugu, had not only long been in use, but had also developed literatures. Many of the books in them were widely known among the masses. Almost always these books were epic in form, poems, or collection of songs and verses, which could easily be memorized. There was practically no prose literature in them at the time. Serious writing was almost confined to Sanskrit and Persian, and every cultured person was supposed to know one of them. These two classical languages played a dominating role and prevented the growth of the popular provincial languages. The printing of books and newspapers broke the hold of the classics, and immediately prose literatures in the provincial languages began to develop. The early Christian missionaries, especially of the Baptist mission at Serampore, helped in this process greatly. The first private printing presses were set up by them, and their efforts to translate the Bible into prose versions of the Indian languages met with considerable success. There was no difficulty in dealing with the well-known and established languages, but the missionaries went further and tackled some of the minor and undeveloped languages and gave them shape and form, compiling grammars and dictionaries for them. They even labored at the dialects of the primitive hill and forest tribes and reduced them to writing. The desire of the Christian missionaries to translate the Bible into every possible language thus resulted in the development of many Indian languages. Christian mission work in India has not always been admirable or praiseworthy, but in this respect, as well as in the collection of folklore, it has undoubtedly been of great service to India. The reluctance of the East India Company to spread education was justified, for as early as 1830 a batch of students of the Hindu College of Calcutta, where Sanskrit and English were taught, demanded certain reforms. They asked for restrictions on the political power of the company and provision for free and compulsory education. Free education was well known in India from the most ancient times. That education was traditional, not very good or profitable, but it was available to poor students without any payment, except some personal service to the teacher. In this respect both the Hindu and Muslim traditions were similar. While the new education was deliberately prevented from spreading, the old education had been largely liquidated in Bengal. When the British seized power in Bengal there were a very large number of maafis, that is tax-free grants of land. Many of these were personal, but most were in the shape of endowments for educational institutions. A vast number of elementary schools of the old type subsisted on them, as well as some institutions for higher education, which was chiefly imparted in Persian. The East India Company was anxious to make money rapidly in order to pay dividends to its shareholders in England, and the demands of its directors were continuous and pressing. A deliberate policy was therefore adopted to resume and confiscate these Maafi lands. Strict proof was demanded of the original grant, but the old sanads and papers had long been lost or eaten up by termites, so the Maafis were resumed and the old holders were ejected, and the schools and colleges lost their endowments. Huge areas were involved in this way and many old families were ruined. The educational establishments, which had been supported by these Maafis, ceased to function, and a vast number of teachers and others connected with them were thrown out of employment. This process helped in ruining the old feudal classes in Bengal, both Muslim and Hindu, as well as those classes who were dependent on them. Muslims were especially affected as they were, as a group, more feudal than the Hindus and were also the chief beneficiaries of the Maafis. Among the Hindus there were far larger numbers of middle-class people engaged in trade and commerce and the professions. These people were more adaptable and took to English education more readily. They were also more useful to the British for their subordinate services. Muslims avoided English education, and in Bengal, they were not looked upon with favor by the British rulers, who were afraid that the remnants of the old ruling class might give trouble. Bengali Hindus thus acquired almost a monopoly in the beginning in the subordinate government service and were sent to the northern provinces. A few Muslims, relics of the old families, were later taken into this service. English education brought a widening of the Indian horizon, an admiration for English literature and institutions, a revolt against some customs and aspects of Indian life, and a growing demand for political reform. The new professional classes took the lead in political agitation, which consisted chiefly in sending representations to government. English-educated people in the professions and the services formed in effect a new class, which was to grow all over India, a class influenced by Western thought and ways and rather cut off from the mass of the population. In 1852 the British Indian Association was started in Calcutta. This was one of the forerunners of the Indian National Congress, and yet a whole generation was to pass before the Congress was started in 1885. This gap represents the period of the revolt of 1857-58, its suppression and its consequences. The great difference between the state of Bengal and that of northern and central India in the middle of the century is brought out by the fact that while in Bengal the new intelligentsia, chiefly Hindu, had been influenced by English thought and literature and looked to England for political constitutional reform, the other areas were seething with the spirit of revolt. In Bengal, one can see more clearly than elsewhere the early effects of British rule and Western influence. The breakup of the agrarian economy was complete, and the old feudal classes had almost been eliminated. In their place had come new landowners whose organic and traditional contacts with the land were far less, and who had few of the virtues and most of the failings of the old feudal landlords. The peasantry suffered famine and spoliation in many ways, and were reduced to extreme poverty. The artisan class was almost wiped out. Over these disjointed and broken up foundations rose new groups and classes, the products of British rule, and connected with it in many ways. There were the merchants who were really middlemen of British trade and industry, profiting by the leavings of that industry. There were also the English-educated classes in the subordinate services, and the learned professions, both looking to the British power for advancement, and both influenced in varying degrees by Western thought. Among these grew up a spirit of revolt against the rigid conventions and social framework of Hindu society. They looked to English liberalism and institutions for inspiration. This was the effect on the upper fringe of the Hindus of Bengal. The mass of the Hindus there were not directly affected, and even the Hindu leaders probably seldom thought of the masses. The Muslims were not affected at all, some individuals apart, and they kept deliberately aloof from the new education. They had been previously backward economically, and they became even more so. The 19th century produced a galaxy of brilliant Hindus in Bengal, and yet there is hardly a single Muslim Bengali leader of any note who stands out there during this period. So far as the masses were concerned, there was hardly any appreciable difference between the Hindus and Muslims. They were indistinguishable in habits, ways of living, language, and in their common poverty and misery. Indeed, nowhere in India were the religious and other differences between Hindus and Muslims of all classes so little marked as in Bengal. Probably 98% of the Muslims were converts from Hinduism, usually from the lowest strata of society. In population figures, there was probably a slight majority of Muslims over Hindus. Today the proportions in Bengal are 53% Muslims, 46% Hindus, 1% others. All these early consequences of the British connection, and the various economic, social, intellectual, and political movements that they gave rise to in Bengal, are noticeable elsewhere in India, but in lesser and varying degrees. The breakup of the old feudal order and economy was less complete, and more gradual elsewhere. In fact, that order rose in rebellion, and even when crushed, survived to some extent. The Muslims in Upper India were culturally and economically far superior to their coreligionists of Bengal, but even they kept aloof from Western education. The Hindus took to this education more easily and were more influenced by Western ideas. The subordinate government services and the professions had far more Hindus than Muslims. Only in the Punjab this difference was less marked. The revolt of 1857-58 flared up and was crushed, but Bengal was hardly touched by it. Throughout the 19th century, the new English-educated class, mainly Hindu, looked up with admiration towards England and hoped to advance with her help and in cooperation with her. There was a cultural renaissance and a remarkable growth of the Bengali language, and the leaders of Bengal stood out as the leaders of political India. Some glimpse of that faith in England which filled the mind of Bengal in those days, as well as of the revolt against old established social codes, may be had from that moving message of Rabindranath Tagore, which he gave on his 80th birthday, May, 1941, a few months before his death. As I look back, he says, on the vast stretch of years that lie behind me and see in clear perspective the history of my early development, I am struck by the change that has taken place both in my own attitude and in the psychology of my countrymen, a change that carries within it a cause of profound tragedy. Our direct contact with the larger world of men was linked up with the contemporary history of the English people whom we came to know in those earlier days. It was mainly through their mighty literature that we formed our ideas with regard to these newcomers to our Indian shores. In those days the type of learning that was served out to us was neither plentiful nor diverse, nor was the spirit of scientific inquiry very much in evidence. Thus, their scope being strictly limited, the educated of those days had recourse to English language and literature. Their days and nights were eloquent with the stately declamations of Burke, with Macaulay's long rolling sentences, discussions centered upon Shakespeare's drama and Byron's poetry, and above all upon the large-hearted liberalism of the 19th century English politics. At the time, though tentative attempts were being made to gain our national independence, at heart we had not lost faith in the generosity of the English race. This belief was so firmly rooted in the sentiments of our leaders as to lead them to hope that the victor would of his own grace pave the path to freedom for the vanquished. This belief was based upon the fact that England at the time provided a shelter to all those who had to flee from persecution in their own country. Political martyrs who had suffered for the honor of their people were accorded unreserved welcome at the hands of the English. I was impressed by this evidence of liberal humanity in the character of the English, and thus, I was led to set them on the pedestal of my highest respect. This generosity in their national character had not yet been vitiated by imperialist pride. About this time, as a boy in England, I had the opportunity of listening to the speeches of John Bright, both in and outside Parliament. The large-hearted radical liberalism of those speeches, overflowing all narrow national bounds, had made so deep an impression on my mind that something of it lingers even today, even in these days of graceless disillusionment. Certainly that spirit of abject dependence upon the charity of our rulers was no matter of pride. What was remarkable, however, was the wholehearted way in which we gave our recognition to human greatness even when it revealed itself in the foreigner. The best and noblest gifts of humanity cannot be the monopoly of a particular race or country, its scope may not be limited nor may it be regarded as the miser's hoard buried underground. That is why English literature, which nourished our minds in the past, does even now convey its deep resonance to the recesses of our heart. Tagore proceeds to refer to the Indian ideal of proper conduct prescribed by the tradition of the race. Narrow in themselves, these time-honored social conventions originated and held good in a circumscribed geographical area, in that strip of land, Brahmvert by name, bound on either side by the rivers Saraswati and Drishti. That is how a Pharisaic formalism gradually got the upper hand of free thought, and the idea proper conduct, which Manu found, established in Brahmavarth, steadily degenerated into socialized tyranny. During my boyhood days, the attitude of the cultured and educated section of Bengal, nurtured on English learning, was charged with a feeling of revolt against these rigid regulations of society. In place of these set codes of conduct, we accepted the ideal of civilization as represented by the English term. In our own family, this change of spirit was welcomed for the sake of its sheer rational and moral force, and its influence was felt in every sphere of our life. Born in that atmosphere, which was moreover colored by our intuitive bias for literature, I naturally set the English on the throne of my heart. Thus passed the first chapters of my life. Then came the parting of ways, accompanied with a painful feeling of disillusion, when I began increasingly to discover how easily those who accepted the highest truths of civilization disowned them with impunity whenever questions of national self-interest were involved. End of Part 6, titled, Contradictions of British Rule in India, Ram Mohan Roy, The Press, Sir William Jones, English Education in Bengal, of Chapter 7.